Transmission received. O5 Council ID detected. Playing log now.
Are We Cool Yet? Are We Cool Yet is an artistic movement existing on the fringes of the international avant-garde, with roots in the early surrealist art movements of the late 19th and early 20th century, and growing the scientific understanding and study of the anomalous that began to develop during that time. The movement has no centralized leadership, no headquarters, very few traditions or conventions, and no official membership roles or requirements. The only thing one needs to do to call oneself a member is to make art that employs, exploits, or revolves around anomalous objects, beings, or phenomena. The organization of an AWCY cell varies wildly from place to place. Many groups are organized into small salons led by a creative mastermind or a professional critic, while others are collectives with no clear leader, and some members prefer to work entirely on their own. In the opinions of some, it is not even necessary to know that the movement exists in order to be part of it. The tendency of such groups to produce highly visible public artworks that cause death, injury, or lasting psychological harm has led some to decry the entire movement as a bunch of art terrorists, a label some of its members wear with pride, some repudiate entirely, and some wear ironically. The largest and most visible gatherings of AWCY artists in any place or time is Sommes-nous devenus magnifiques, a grand exhibition held every 10 years since 1874, at which those in the know can gather to view and scrutinize a selection of some of the finest works in anomalous art produced over the previous decade. To have a work accepted is considered, by those who care of such things, to be one of the greatest achievements an artist can attain in a career, and members of cells all around the world petition to have their works displayed. Birth of the Cool. In the 19th century, the march of progress made it possible for the first time for human science to contemplate and comprehend those phenomena which had long seemed to contravene the laws of nature. Within a matter of decades, concepts that had long been viewed as witchcraft or sorcery were laid bare in the terms of a new and secret science, and governments and organizations around the world began to classify, study, and collect all such anomalies. And just as artists throughout history have turned a critical eye to the events of the day in their work, so too did the artists of this scientific renaissance begin to interpret these new discoveries on canvas. By the 1870s, Paris was the center of the world of anomalous art, and the city stood witness to endless debates about the role of the anomalous in art, or whether such a role existed at all. When, in 1874, the famed Salon des Magnifiques refused to allow any works of phantasmagorical nature to be displayed at their grand exhibition, those artists shut out by the committee organized their own counter-exhibition, to be held at the same time across the river. Sommes-nous devenus magnifiques, as the show came to be called, was the talk of the Parisian press for months, earning equal amounts of curiosity, dismissal, and outright derision. But the exiled gadflies had made their point. The paranormal, the anomalous, and the bizarre had found a place in the world of art and would not be so easily gotten rid of. Sommes-nous devenus magnifiques held its exhibitions every 10 years thereafter, and as time passed, the world of anomalous art grew larger. From its beginnings in Paris, artists from all across France and Europe, and later from the Americas and the Orient as well, began attending the increasingly prestigious and increasingly bizarre and difficult to keep hidden from the disdainful eyes of a concerned government exhibition expressing new and different interpretations of the role of the anomalous in human life. It was at the 6th Decennial Exhibition in 1924 that the growing rift between the two largest schools of thought, logical versus emotional, science versus faith, old world versus new, came to a head, for it was at that show that for the first time the works of the French surrealist Marcel Duchamp would be exhibited alongside those of Ruiz Marco, the Mexican artist whose themes of magical realism and religious awe intertwined with the viscerally accessible Fortinia of our world had set art critics worldwide at war with each other. Those who saw the two during the days leading up to the opening of the exhibition said they spent nearly the entire time in heated discussion with one another, in English, for neither spoke the other's mother tongue confidently, about everything under the sun, the importance of the artist in relation to his work, the importance of context, faith, knowledge, law, free will, God, the state, democracy, Marxism, the war, the League of Nations, and the best way to serve a cup of coffee. It seemed that they might continue bickering throughout the entire exhibition, but as the artists prepared to greet the assembled press on the morning of its grand opening, they appeared to have finally come to an understanding. If there is one image that comes to the mind of any art historian when the 1924 Expo is brought up, it is that iconic photo of Duchamp and Ruiz posing side by side with their fellow artists in front of the still closed doors. Marcos seemingly leaning over to whisper something into Duchamp's ear. For decades, many have speculated on what words Marcos had with his colleague during that memorable instant. A question of metaphysics, or a challenge? An affirmation of their coming to terms? A reminder of the reason why they were there at that moment of time? Perhaps an expression of amazement at the multitudes that had come to see them? According to one reporter who claimed he stood close enough to overhear that whisper amidst the din of the crowd, it was all five at once, expressed in 4 simple words. Are we cool yet? Excerpt from The Coolest War, Memories of a Critic, by Anonymous. Birth by Guitar. Some people are fond of saying that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It would be more accurate to say that history is doomed to repeat itself. Excerpt from The Coolest War, Memories of a Critic, by Anonymous. As the sun set over the Seine River, the migration began. It was slow at first, with a few figures crossing the waters by bridge. As the sky darkened, the travelers multiplied. They came in bicycles, boats, taxis, and trucks. A few walked, a few more ran. The sun sank completely below the horizon, and the migration ceased. The crowd, now a few hundred strong, reached its destination, merging with the multitude of individuals who were already there. It was closing time at the Saint-Menu Devenu Magnifique, and the final exhibition was about to begin. The Saint-Menu Devenu Magnifique opened its doors for a month every 10 years, closing them for 15 minutes at sundown. A large poster glued to the wall of the gallery lied about the reason for this closing in 17 different languages. The poster identified the downtime as, among other things, a time to have lunch, in French, a cleaning period, English, a dirtying period, German, and a mandatory smoking break, Swahili. In truth, the gallery did not shut down during these 15 minutes. It simply moved outdoors. The gallery's doors swung closed, and a final figure darted between them. She carried a weathered guitar under her arm. The figure leaned against the side of the building and began to tune her guitar. When the job was finished, she raised her head, acknowledging the crowd for the first time. Gasped the guitarist, feigning surprise. Who might you lot be? The crowd erupted into a roar of sound as hundreds of voices rose to answer the question. The guitarist clicked her tongue. This simply will not do, she said. You must appoint a speaker from within your ranks if you wish to be heard. She paused. adjusting a few of the strings on the guitar. "Go on, make your selection. Choose somebody to do the talking. Nobody in particular." As it did every night, the crowd parted to reveal a serene, well-dressed man. The man strode to the front of the crowd and locked eyes with the guitarist. The crowd held its breath. The man coughed, and the exchange began. It was an old performance, one that had been scripted decades earlier. As the two players spoke, the members of the audience mouthed the performers' lines, having seen the exchange dozens of times before. "And who are you?" asked the guitarist. "I am as you requested," replied the man. "Nobody in particular." "Why are you here?" asked the guitarist, gesturing towards the crowd. "What did you hope to accomplish by gathering before me tonight?" "We have come to be cool." "Why not take a dip in the river then?" the guitarist replied with a smile. The crowd chuckled. The joke wasn't particularly funny and hadn't matured well after 1,000 repetitions, but the crowd always chuckled. "We're here to listen to music." "Is there anything you had in mind?" the guitarist asked, lazily strumming a chord. "A special song, stolen from the future." The man doffed his hat. The guitarist grinned. "Ah, but the future comes later." She placed her hand on the neck of the guitar. "It will be stealing from me." The exchange was completed. The crowd cheered, then fell silent as the guitarist began to hum. She tried a few notes before she felt her voice catch on the proper one. She hummed again, and her voice caught again. She tried once more, and felt the catch in her throat tear itself free, releasing a deep, throaty voice. The guitarist opened her mouth and sang, "Brother, won't you lend your ear, and help me if you can, 'cause I ain't seen hide nor hair of the mana charity man. They said he had no soul for jailin', nor the talents for work and art. The circus didn't call him no, he's been helpin' from the start. Well, if mana falls from heaven, then it lands above our heads. But don't you frown, 'cause the charity man said he'll keep all of us fed. Oh, the factory's still now workin', smokestacks pushin' smoke. Assembly line still movin', overseer can't take a joke. Brother, won't you lend me your ear and help me if you can, 'cause I ain't seen hide nor hair of the mana charity man. Charity man said don't you worry now. Charity man said don't you cry. Said he's knocking on the doors all the way to heaven. Ain't nobody gonna turn a blind eye. Seen jailers down over by the docks. Jailers don't understand. Jailer man always asking if I've seen the mana charity man. Charity man's been working on something way deep underground. But I ain't seen no charity man since the jailers came looking round. Brother, won't you lend your ear and help me if you can, 'cause I ain't seen hide nor hair of the mana charity man." The guitarist bowed her head, and the crowd applauded. The man smiled and tipped his hat again, vanishing into the throng. The doors of the gallery creaked open, and the wind picked up, carrying the song to the lips of the performer who would sing it for the first time years later. Somewhere between the singers, in a small house in New York, an insomniac tapped his pen against a sheet of paper. He was meant to be writing a highly important letter, concerning nothing less than the fate of humanity, but he could not find the right words. Truth be known, the writer was beginning to doubt his own cause. A breeze blew through the window, and the paper rippled beneath the pen. The writer rose to close his shutters, then froze. For a moment, he was certain that he'd heard a voice drifting through the room along with the wind. Then he dropped back into his seat and began to write, the voice and window forgotten, in the interest of sharing all of God's miracles with the least of his children, and in the interest of humanity as a whole. I am pleased to announce the formation of a new organization that shall work towards the liberation of those in poverty, in depression, and in the throes of death. This organization shall hereby be known as the Mana Charitable Foundation. May it prosper for generations to come, and all of mankind with it. Living in the Limelight. I believe it was Shakespeare who said, "All the world's indeed a stage, and we are merely players, performers, and portrayers, each another's audience outside the gilded cage." He was half right. Excerpt from The Coolest War, Memories of a Critic, by Anonymous. The symphony hall was packed to capacity for what promised to be the event of the season. Ushers led men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns down dimly lit walkways to their seats, the twinkling of hundreds of tiny lights on the chandeliers overhead illuminating the elaborate architecture. The city's finest conversed in their box seats, the elite and the middle class sat out front to see and be seen, and in the galleries, even the less fortunate of the city had put on their Sunday finest and turned out. A hush fell over the assembled multitudes as the conductor stepped onto the stage, empty save for his podium. The audience rose in respect as the 30-ish impresario in an impeccable white tie took his position upstage, bowing once to the crowd to signal that they could sit. The conductor turned to the podium, where his sheet music and baton lay at the ready. He opened the book to the first movement of tonight's performance, looked straight ahead at the empty space before him, lifted his baton, and the performance began. A sense of shock and wonder rippled through the crowd as the first bars of the overture ran out. Aggressive, powerful, demanding attention. A brief pause allowed the crowd to compose themselves. There was no band on stage. There were no speakers anywhere to carry the sound, and yet, as sure as they could hear their own breathing, they heard music. Before they had too long to ponder it, the second bar hit them. At first, just the horns. Then came the violins, the bass section, oboes, flutes, timpani, and the sound of an entire orchestra filled the hall and echoed from front to back. The conductor kept time and signaled the invisible, imaginary band with his baton, sweat dripping down his brow as he struggled to ensure that the cellists were in tune and the xylophonist wasn't coming in too early. He gave them a 5-minute preview in music of what he hoped would be his magnum opus, the history of creation itself. And as the final strings of the overture gave way to the lone drum representing the heartbeat of the last man alive, or perhaps the first, he prepared himself for the part he had not yet performed before an audience. The Moog synthesizer kicked in as the conductor grabbed the podium with his free hand, twisted it around 90 degrees counterclockwise, turned himself sideways to face the crowd on the left and the fictional orchestra on his right, and picked up the second baton. With a quivering hand, the conductor raised his second baton toward the audience and flicked it like a magic wand, the Moog providing a sting to punctuate the flick. Nothing. The violins quivered along with his hand as he tried the flick again. Still nothing. The theremins kick in on the third try, and with a third flick and the sound of the gong, the chandelier hanging above the floor seats vanishes, leaving only 100 flickering bits of light in midair. The crowd gasped and applauded politely, but the conductor only raised a finger to his lips, a shh provided by the electric guitarist's vocoder as he carried on. Continuing to direct the orchestra with the baton in his right hand, he now stared upward at the flickering lights, pointing at one with his baton and nudging it slightly to the left. He pointed at another and moved it up somewhat, then another which he directed to fly around in a circle. Before long, the points of light were flying every which way around the hall, up and down, front to back, swinging in grand arcs over the balcony, or zigzagging or orbiting the head of a particularly confused old woman in the front. The orchestra carried on in a regimented cacophony, dozens of leitmotifs representing the different lights as they swirled around, joyful, playful, ever in flux. 1 minute a minuet as 2 lights seemed to dance around each other, another anticipatory as one slowly wiggled its way up from the floor to the top of the hall, triumphant as it swirled above all the other lights, and then a crashing sense of betrayal as it swung down, colliding straight into another light, and the light broke apart and was snuffed out, accentuated with the sound of the cannon. Silence fell, and the 100 lights stopped their play and gathered in a circle around the attacker. The string soloists called out in confusion and mourning. Why? How? What has happened? The time for wonderment was short-lived, as from the back another light swooped down and smashed into another, extinguishing it, then a third, then a fourth. The gathered lights panicked and grew a bright blue, huddling together at first in fear, then some of their own launching outward to defend themselves against the yellow-red aggressors. The machine gunners kept time, the bassoon sounded the march, and the accordionist wailed. It was war. Few in the crowd took the time to look at the conductor as the war raged on above them. Had they would have seen the sweat dripping from his brow, his hair soaking wet from it, his hands wildly flailing in both directions at once as his mind focused on keeping both his imaginary productions in sync. The orchestra rose to a crescendo as the room grew dimmer, more and more of the once so innocent lights vanishing into the darkness, and the last handful of blue lights gathered together in a ball, their attackers orbiting around them like a giant molecule of some unimaginable element, diving in and out in an attempt to penetrate the defense. A single chord that the conductor had hoped would sound like one from A Day in the Life sounded out from the entire band in unison as all the attackers swooped in at once, and the entire concert hall erupted in a blinding flash of white light. The lone drumbeat returned as the light faded, and the crowd could see that the ceiling of the concert hall had been dematerialized entirely, and beyond it there stood nothing but a sky full of millions of stars. The conductor set his batons down as the drumming stopped, turned to face the audience, and gave a short bow. The crowd applauded thunderously, some of them rapt with joy, others with tears running down their faces, all of them looking forward to the second movement. The conductor cleared his throat and snapped his fingers, and in an instant the performance was over. The roar of the crowd ceased as the men and women disappeared back into the ether from which they came, and the walls fell in until the concert hall was once again the rehearsal space of the West Soho Performing Arts Center. Well, there you have it, the conductor said to the two actual humans remaining of his audience of thousands. Concerto No. 3 for Reality Warper, first movement, The Fall of Heaven. What do you think? The bespectacled, middle-aged man in a Grateful Dead t-shirt, his long, graying hair tied back in a ponytail, gave a tentative nod of agreement. Well, you put half of your audience to sleep, the critic said as he gestured to the 10-year-old boy who'd nodded off next to him. But I was a Philistine at his age too. The lighting effects were a little amateurish, and the score could use more Steinman and less ELP. But your work with the audience has improved by leaps and bounds. I swear, I recognize my old drill sergeant sitting 2 rows behind us. Thank you, the conductor said. I'm planning on elaborating more on the visual effects in the second movement. We haven't even gotten to the creation of man yet, after all. It ought to be ready by the next time you're in town, if you'll have time to see it. I look forward to it, Mr. Chesapeake, the critic responded as he stood up and headed for the door. Keep working on this, and by 84, you'll be ready to make a big splash. Leave the sheet music on my desk, and I'll have some more detailed notes for you by the weekend. Oh, and if we can do the next session earlier in the day so your son can stay awake through the whole thing, I'm sure he's got an artist's soul buried in there somewhere. Doctor's note. I know. It has been months, and the last time I came back, it had been months. I swear, the Foundation keeps moving me from location to location. I have relocated multiple times at this point, simply due to their request, and as you can see, I'm no longer doing the actual objects in order. I'm now doing groups of interest, for whatever reason. Again, this is entirely by the whims of the admins and whoever assigns these to me. So I hope this was informative. It seems that Are We Cool Yet is simply anonymous but artists. That's cool, I guess. Their actual art isn't that cool in my opinion. I've seen a handful of the works we've collected. Some of them are very interesting, while the majority are pretty mundane. It's the way that you view graffiti, in my opinion. Some of it's really, really cool and high quality, but the vast majority means nothing and is disgusting.